the medical supplies from her crashed ship filled. 3 cases that the Korath carried back to the settlement without apparent effort. Yuna worked through the night in a chamber that served as the pack's healing space, surrounded by elders who watched her every movement with suspicion and doubt. The sick whelps were brought to her one at a time. Small creatures whose thin fur and labored breathing spoke of a disease that had plagued the pack for generations. She examined the first patient with gentle hands and found symptoms that her training allowed her to recognize. The illness attacked the young during their first winter, weakening their immune systems and leaving them vulnerable to the cold that should not have been able to harm them. It was a cruel disease because it struck only the young, only the ones who had not yet grown strong enough to fight it off. The Korath healers had tried everything they knew. Herbs and heat and rituals passed down through countless generations. But nothing had worked each winter. Took a handful of whelps who should have grown to become hunters and leaders and parents themselves. Yuna studied her supplies and calculated dosages based on body, weight, and species differences. And she explained each step of her process. To the healers who stood at her shoulder, she showed them the compounds she would use and described how they worked at a level that her translator could convey. Some of the elders seemed interested despite themselves, asking questions that proved they were not merely predators, but thinkers who wanted to understand the medicine that might save their young. 3 whelps received treatment that night. The process was slow and careful because Yuna refused to rush something so important, and she monitored each patient constantly for any sign of adverse reaction. The first 2 responded well, their breathing easing and their temperatures stabilizing within hours. The third was one of Senuk's own offspring, a whelp that had been hidden away in shame because its father could not bear to watch it weaken and die. Yuna treated it with the same care she had given the others, and by the time the first light of dawn touched the ice outside, she could see improvement that even the skeptics could not deny. Senuk came to see his child near morning, and his expression when he looked upon the sleeping whelp was something Yuna had never expected to see on a Korath face. It was hope, raw and painful and barely contained, but hope nonetheless. He did not thank her. His pride would not allow that. Not yet. But he did not call for her death either. And when he left the healing chamber, his steps were slower and his shoulders were lower, as if some great weight had been lifted from his back. The council reconvened as the sun rose higher over the frozen moon. Varath stood at the center of the chamber and announced that the human had fulfilled her challenge, that the sick whelps were recovering, that she had proven her worth through action rather than words alone. No one argued. Even Senuk remained silent when his turn came to speak. The judgment was rendered without ceremony. Yuna would be allowed to live. She would be granted the status of pack friend, a rank that had not been given to an outsider in living memory. The whelps crowded around her when the announcement came, and first pressed its head against her leg with a sound that needed no translation. They had won against all odds and expectations. They had won, but the victory celebration was cut short by a new development that changed everything. Yuna's emergency beacon had finally reached friendly ears, and a human patrol ship was approaching the moon at high speed. The communication came through on her damaged translator. A burst of static followed by a familiar voice demanding her status and location. The Korath heard it too, and the mood in the settlement shifted instantly from celebration to alarmed. Humans were coming, armed humans, in a ship that carried weapons capable of devastating the entire settlement if its crew decided the Korath were a threat. Yuna saw fear in the eyes of creatures who had shown her nothing but strength and pride, and she understood that everything she had accomplished could be undone in moments. If she did not act, she asked Vorith for permission to respond to her people, and the Alpha granted it with a gesture that spoke of desperate trust. She activated her communicator and spoke to the patrol ship in a voice that was calm despite the pounding of her heart. "This is Diplomatic Courier Una Esio. I am alive and unharmed. Hold position at the system boundary and do not approach without my authorization." The response came back confused and concerned, the ship's captain demanding to know why she was issuing such orders. She explained as briefly as she could, telling them that she had made contact with the Korath, that she had established a foundation for diplomatic relations that could change everything humans knew about this species. She told them to wait. She told them to trust her, and after a long moment of silence, the captain agreed to hold position until she gave further instructions. Una turned back to Vorith and made a proposal that she had been forming in her mind since the Council's judgment. "Let me be a bridge between our peoples," she said. "I will speak for you to my kind, and for them to you, not as a spy or a conqueror, but as proof that trust is possible." Vorith considered her words while the pack waited in silence. Then he moved forward and extended one massive paw, and Una saw a claw emerge that gleamed like polished steel in the morning light. "Those who speak for the pack must carry the pack's mark," he said, and his voice held weight of ritual and ancient tradition. Una understood what he was asking. She extended her own hand, palm up, and did not flinch as the claw drew a thin line across her skin. Blood welled up, red and warm, and Vorith pressed his own paw against her wound so that their blood mingled for a single moment before the cut began to heal. The scar would remain forever, a mark that any Korath would recognize as the sign of one who had earned the pack's trust. She was the first human to carry it. She would not be the last. An hour later, Una walked across the ice toward the boundary where the human ship waited. And she was not alone. First walked at her right side, now fully grown in her eyes, though still young by Korath standards, Guard and 3 other pack members flanked them in an honor formation that announced their purpose to any who watched behind her. The settlement stood quiet against the frozen cliffs, and somewhere in the healing chamber 3 whelps slept peacefully through their first morning of recovery. She had come to this moon as a courier carrying messages between distant stations. She left it as something far more important, a bridge between worlds, a friend of wolves, a human who had proven that sometimes the greatest strength is not the power to destroy, but the courage to lie down among predators and trust that kindness would find a way. The scar on her palm ached with each step, but it was a good ache. It was the ache of change and possibility, and a future that no one had dared to imagine until she chose to sleep with the wolf cubs and earned the Alpha's protection by sunrise. The Korath settlement was carved into the heart of a frozen cliff, a vast network of chambers and tunnels that had been home to the pack for generations beyond counting. Una walked through corridors of blue ice lit by a soft glow that seemed to come from the walls themselves, some kind of bioluminescent organism that the Korath had cultivated long before humans learned to make fire. Adults lined the passages as she passed, their golden eyes tracking her every movement with expressions that ranged from curiosity to open hostility. She kept her head down and her steps careful and tried not to think about how easily any one of them could end her life. The whelps stayed close, forming a protective barrier that the adults seemed reluctant to breach. First walked at her right side with its head held high, and the message of its posture was clear to everyone who looked. This human belongs to us. The council chamber was the largest space Una had seen in the settlement, a circular room with walls that curved up to form a dome high overhead. Stone seats ringed the perimeter, occupied by what she assumed were the elders and leaders of the pack. And at the center stood a raised platform where Vorith waited with patient intensity. She was led to stand before the platform while the whelps arranged themselves behind her in a silent show of support. The chamber felt quiet, and the weight of that silence pressed against her chest like a physical force. Vorith spoke first, addressing the assembled council in a language of vibrations and sounds that her translator could only partially decode. She caught fragments of meaning here and there, words like intruder and sacred ground and judgment. But the full context remained beyond her grasp. Then a new voice cut through the proceedings, louder and more aggressive than Vorith's measured tones. Yuna turned to see another alpha-sized Korath rise from its seat and stalk toward the center of the chamber. This one was darker than Vorith, with fur so black it seemed to absorb the light around it, and its eyes held nothing but contempt as they fixed upon her. This was Senuk. She would learn later, he was the leader of a rival faction within the pack, one that had long opposed any contact with the species that spread across the galaxy like a disease. Senuk's argument was simple, and brutal humans were known throughout the sector as destroyers who killed what they feared and feared what they did not understand. This female had violated sacred ground and contaminated the young with her alien scent. The only appropriate response was death, quick and clean, before she could bring more of her kind to threaten everything the Korath held dear. The council murmured in what sounded like agreement, and Yuna felt her hope begin to fade. She had no weapons, no allies, no leverage except the uncertain protection of 7 young predators who might not be able to save her from the judgment of their own elders. Then Vorith spoke again, and the murmuring stopped. He pointed toward Little, still held in Yuna's arms, and made a series of sounds that her translator rendered as a question. The small one should have died in the cold. How does it live now? Yuna understood that she was being given a chance to speak, and she took a breath and searched for words that might bridge the vast gulf between her species and theirs. I fed it, she said, and her translator worked to convert her speech into vibrations the Korath could understand. I gave it warmth from my own body. I did not let it die because I could not stand to watch it suffer. Senuk made a sound of disgust. It should have died. The weak must fall so the strong can rise. This is the way of all hunters since the beginning of time. Then your way is not my way, Yuna replied, and she heard gasps from the council at her boldness. Humans do not abandon the weak. We fight for them because we know that weakness today does not mean weakness forever. She knelt and set Little on the ground, and the small whelp stood on shaky legs and looked up at her with eyes that glowed silver bright. This one was dying when I found it, she continued, but it lives now, not because I am strong, but because I chose to care. Is that not also a form of strength? The chamber fell silent again as the council considered her words. Vorith moved close and examined Little with careful attention, and his expression shifted as he noted the change in the whelp's condition. What had been dying was now alive. What had been abandoned was now fighting to survive, and the cause of that transformation stood before them. Small and soft and utterly without claws or fangs or any of the weapons that the Korath valued. Senuk would not accept defeat easily. He challenged Vorith directly, demanding that the human prove her worth through action rather than words alone. Talk was cheap, he argued, and any creature could make promises it never intended to keep. If this human wanted to live, she must demonstrate her value to the pack before the next moonrise. Yuna's heart sank at the challenge because she did not know what she could possibly offer to creatures who valued strength above all else. She had no weapons to fight with, no skills in hunting or combat, nothing that would impress predators who had survived on this frozen moon for thousands of years. But then she remembered her ship. She remembered the cargo, she had been carrying when she crashed. The diplomatic supplies that included medical equipment meant for remote outposts far from proper hospitals. She had seen the way some of the adults moved with stiffness in their joints, and she had noticed the thin fur on several of the young ones, who had been kept apart from the main nursery. There was sickness here, something that her training allowed her to recognize even across species barriers. "I can help your sick ones," she said. And the words came out before she could stop them. "I carry medicine from my ship, compounds that might cure what ails your young." Senek laughed. A harsh barking sound. "You think we would trust you to give unknown substances to our children? You could poison them all and call it medicine." "Then let me show you," Yuna replied. "Let me explain what each compound does. Let your healers watch everything I do. If they see danger, they can stop me at any moment." She looked at Varth and made the gesture of submission she had learned. "Give me one night. If I fail, then Senek can have his judgment. But if I succeed, then you will know that humans are worth more than fear." Varth considered her offer while the council waited in tense silence. Finally, he turned to Senek and made a sound that carried the weight of ancient authority. "The whelps chose her. By our oldest laws, she is standing until she proves herself unworthy. One night is not too much to ask." Senek snarled, but did not argue further. The Alpha had spoken, and even rivals knew better than to push too far against a decision made in open council. Yuna bowed her head and felt the whelps press close around her in silent celebration. She had bought herself time. Nothing more. Now she had to figure out how to use it. The creature that entered the chamber was nothing like the whelps that it kept. Yuna warmed through the night. It stood as tall as a horse at the shoulder, with 6 powerful limbs that ended in claws as long as her fingers. And its fur was not silver, but dark gray streaked with white like storm clouds over ice. The eyes that fixed upon her burned gold with an intelligence that was unmistakably ancient and sharp. This was Varth, the alpha of the pack, though Yuna would not learn his name until later. Right now she only knew that Death had walked into the chamber wearing fur and teeth, and it was looking at her with the focused attention of a predator that had found unexpected prey. Varth moved forward with a grace that seemed impossible for something so large, and Yuna felt every muscle in her body locked tight with the urge to run. But there was nowhere to run, and running would only trigger the chase instinct that all predators shared. So she stood her ground and held little against her chest and waited for whatever would come next. The Alpha drew close, enough that she could feel the heat of its breath, and it lowered its massive head to sniff at her with nostrils that flared wide as it took in her scent. She smelled wrong to it. She knew that much. She smelled like nothing it had ever encountered before, like metal and sweat and the strange chemicals that humans carried in their blood. She smelled like an intruder who had violated the most sacred. Space and Karath society. Varth's lips pulled back to reveal teeth that could crush bone without effort, and a sound rose from its throat that was less a growl than a promise of violence. Yuna closed her eyes and prepared to die. But then something unexpected happened. First, stepped forward and pressed its small body against Varth's front leg, and it made a sound that Yuna had not heard before. A rapid series of vibrations that seemed to carry meaning far beyond what she could understand. The other whelps joined in, surrounding the Alpha with their voices raised in what could only be described as pleading. They were defending her, these young creatures that she had known for less than a day were putting themselves between her and their own pack leader. And the sounds they made carried a message that even Yuna could interpret. She is not dangerous. She kept us warm. She belongs with us. Varth's growl faded into silence as the Alpha looked down at the whelps with an expression that seemed almost like confusion. In all its years of leading this pack, it had never seen the Young behaved this way toward an outsider. The judgment of whelps was sacred in Korath culture because they could not lie there. Instincts were pure and uncorrupted by the complex politics that adults navigated when whelps declared something to be true. The pack was bound to consider it seriously. The alpha circled Una slowly, examining her from every angle while the whelps continued their chorus of defense. She felt its gaze like a physical weight pressing against her skin, measuring her worth against the threat she represented. She knew that one wrong move would end this standoff in blood. So she did the only thing she could think of. She opened her mouth and produced the low humming sound she had practiced through the night. The vibration that she hoped would translate as peace and gratitude. Varth stopped circling its ears, which had been pressed flat against its skull, rose slightly as it registered her attempt at communication. Una pushed further, straining to remember every lesson she had learned about Korath expression. She lowered her head in a gesture of submission that she had seen the whelps use when approaching each other. She exposed her throat even though every survival instinct screamed against it, and she spoke the only phrase she had been able to construct during the long night, pushing the words through the vibration of her chest and throat in a way that felt alien and painful. I kept them warm. The sounds that came out were clumsy and probably malformed, but the meaning seemed to reach Vorith anyway. The alpha's eyes widened slightly, and it looked at her with something new in its gaze. Not hunger, not rage, something that might have been the beginning of respect. Vorith moved toward her again, but this time the motion was not threatening. It lowered its head and sniffed at Little. The small whelp still clutched against her chest. The runt had always been weak. Una understood now the pack had expected it to die during the cold season, because that was the way of things among predators who could not afford to waste resources on those who would not survive. But Little was alive. Little was not just alive, but stronger than it had been when Una first found it. And its fur carried her scent so deeply that it would probably never fully fade. She had done what the pack could not or would not do. She had kept the weakest one breathing through the long night. When the cold should have taken it, Varth made a sound that rumbled through the chamber like distant thunder, and the other adults who had been waiting at the entrance began to file in. There were 5 of them in total, each nearly as large as the alpha, and they surrounded Una in a ring of fur and teeth and golden eyes. She should have been terrified. She was terrified, but she did not let her fear show, because showing fear now would undo everything the whelps had done to save her. The adults conferred in their vibrating language, too fast and complex for Una to follow, and she stood in the center of their circle and waited for a verdict she could not predict. Minutes passed. That felt like hours. Finally, Vorith turned back to her and made a sound that her translator device struggled to process. The words that appeared on her display were fragmented and uncertain, but the meaning was clear enough. You will speak. It was not a question. It was not a threat. It was an invitation that no human had ever received from the Korath. She had earned the right to defend herself before the pack, and that right had been granted not through strength or cunning, but through the simple act of kindness toward creatures that could not repay her. Una bowed her head again and held Little close and followed Vorith out of the nursery chamber into the larger tunnels beyond. The whelps came with her, refusing to let her out of their sight, and first walked at her side like a guardian that had chosen its duty without being asked. She did not know what waited for her in the depths of the Korath settlement. She did not know if she would survive the next hour or the next day, but she knew one thing with absolute certainty. She had done something that no diplomat or soldier or politician had ever accomplished. She had made the wolves listen, Now she had to find the words to make them understand. The night stretched long and cold beyond the cave walls, while Yuna drifted between sleep and waking. Each time she opened her eyes, she saw the same scene around her. The pile of silver-furred whelps pressed close for warmth, the faint glow of their eyes in the darkness, and the small one still curled against her chest, like it had found the only safe place in the universe. Her survival suit beeped quiet warnings about power levels and temperature regulation, but she ignored them because there was nothing she could do except conserve what energy remained and hope it would be enough. The bold whelp, the one who had first approached her, lifted its head and made a low sound that Yuna felt more than heard. The vibration traveled through the stone floor and into her bones, and she recognized it as a question. Even though she did not know the specific meaning, she responded the only way she could, placing her hand flat against the ground and humming a low note that she hoped would translate as something peaceful. The whelp tilted its head and then settled back down, apparently satisfied with her answer. This was how she had spent her years of training, learning the subtle languages of species that did not speak with words the way humans did. And she had never imagined that those skills would be tested in a situation like this. She had always pictured herself in proper diplomatic chambers with translators and protocols, not lying on cold stones surrounded by young predators while a blizzard raged outside. But life rarely followed the paths that people planned for it. The small one in her arms stirred and made a thin sound of distress, and Yuna shifted to hold it more securely while checking its condition as best she could. It was weak, far weaker than the others, and she could feel the bones beneath its thin fur with troubling clarity. This one had been struggling before she arrived, and she wondered if the adults had already decided it would not survive the season. Among many predator species, the weak were left to die so the strong could thrive, and the Korath were nothing if not predators. But Yuna was human, and humans had a strange habit of fighting for the ones that others had given up on. She opened her pack again and found the nutrient paste she had been saving for emergencies, and she squeezed a small amount onto her finger and held it near the small one's mouth. It sniffed and then licked the paste with a tongue that was rough like sandpaper, and it made a sound that Yuna chose to interpret as gratitude. She gave it more, feeding it slowly while the others watched with what seemed like confusion. They did not understand why she would waste resources on one that was already marked for death. She could not explain it to them in any language they would comprehend. So she simply continued what she was doing and let her actions speak for themselves. Hours passed in this way, with Yuna dozing and waking and caring for the whelps as if they were her own. She learned to recognize each of them by small differences in their fur patterns and the sounds they made, and she gave them names in her mind, even though she knew they already had names she would never be able to pronounce. The bold one she called first, because it had been the first to trust her. The largest she called Guard, because it positioned itself near the chamber entrance and watched for danger. The small one she called Little, a simple name for a simple truth. There were 7 in total, and by the middle of the night, Yuna knew each of them well, enough to predict how they would move and what sounds they would make in response to different situations. She wondered about their parents and the rest of the pack. Korath hunted in groups during the cold season, tracking prey across the ice fields for days at a time before returning to their dens with food for the young. The whelps had been left here because the nursery was the safest place, guarded by the warmth of the earth below and hidden from the storms that swept the surface. The adults would return when the hunt was finished, and when they did, they would find something they had never expected: a human sleeping among their children. Yuna tried not to think about what would happen. Then she focused instead on the present moment, on the warmth of the bodies around her and the steady breathing of Little against her chest. The whelp had grown stronger since she started feeding it. Or perhaps she only imagined that because she wanted it to be true. Either way, she continued to care for it through the long night, giving it food and warmth and the kind of attention that its own pack had apparently decided it did not deserve. Near what she guessed was midnight, the storm outside grew worse. And even deep in the cave, she could hear the wind screaming across the ice. The temperature dropped further, and the whelps pressed closer together in response, creating a mound of fur and heat that kept them all alive. Yuna found herself at the center of that mound, surrounded by creatures that weighed more than they looked and breathed with a rhythm that was almost hypnotic. She should have been afraid. Every rational part of her mind told her that she was in terrible danger, that the moment the adults returned, she would face judgment from a species known throughout the galaxy for killing first and asking questions never. But fear required energy that she did not have. And so she let it go and allowed herself to simply exist in this moment of strange peace. First lifted its head again and made a new sound, one that Yuna had not heard before. It was higher than the others, almost musical. And the other whelps responded with similar sounds of their own. She realized after a moment that they were singing, not singing the way humans did, with words and melody, but singing in the way that pack animals often did, reinforcing their bonds with shared vibrations that said, "We are together and we are safe." Yuna hummed along, adding her voice to theirs, even though she knew she was an outsider who did not truly belong. The whelps did not seem to mind. They adjusted their song to include her contribution, weaving her human sounds into their alien harmony as if she had always been part of their pack. Tears formed in her eyes and froze on her cheeks before she could wipe them away. She had spent her whole career trying to build bridges between species, trying to prove that different beings could understand each other if they only tried. And here in this cave, surrounded by young predators on a frozen moon at the edge of known space, she had finally succeeded in a way she never expected. The night continued. The storm raged, and Yuna sang with the wolves until exhaustion finally claimed her and pulled her down into deep dreamless sleep. She did not know how long she slept before a new vibration woke her, one that came not from the whelps but from somewhere deeper in the cave system. The ground itself seemed to shake with the weight of something massive approaching. The whelps felt it too. They rose from their pile and positioned themselves around Yuna in a loose circle, and their postures had changed from relaxed to alert in the space of a single heartbeat. First stood directly in front of her, between her and the chamber entrance, and the sound it made now was not a song. It was a warning. The adults had returned. Yuna's heart pounded against her ribs as she gathered little in her arms and rose slowly to her feet. The chamber entrance darkened as something large blocked the faint light from beyond, and she saw eyes that glowed not silver but gold-looking in at her with an intelligence that made her feel very small and very fragile. The Alpha had come home, and now she would learn whether her choice to sleep among the wolves would save her or end her. The ship screamed as it fell through the thin atmosphere of the ice moon. Yuna ACO gripped the emergency handles and watched the control panel flash red warnings in every direction. And she knew with cold certainty that she was going to crash on a world where no human had ever set foot before. The transport vessel had been small and fast, perfect for carrying diplomatic messages between stations in the outer sectors. But it was never built to survive a collision with debris, and now it tumbled toward the frozen surface like a wounded bird falling from the sky. She pulled hard on the manual controls and forced the nose upward, and the ship groaned in protest as metal bent and systems failed one after another. The ground rushed up to meet her impact came with a sound like thunder, and Yuna was thrown forward against the restraints as the ship carved a long trench through ice and snow before finally stopping against a ridge of frozen rock. For a long moment she did not move, Her ears rang and her vision blurred, but she was alive. And that simple fact seemed impossible given what she had just survived. Slowly, she released her restraints and checked herself for injuries, finding bruises and small cuts, but nothing that would kill her. And she allowed herself one breath of relief before turning her attention to the ship. The damage was severe hull breaches in 3 sections, life support failing, communications array destroyed, and the emergency beacon flickering with weak power that might or might not be enough to send a signal into space. She activated the beacon anyway and hoped that someone, somewhere would hear her call for help. The environmental readings made her stomach tight with fear. Outside temperature was dropping fast as the moon rotated away from its parent star, and within hours the surface would reach levels that would freeze her blood in her veins even inside her survival suit. Her suit had taken damage in the crash, and the heating system was working at only partial capacity, which meant she needed shelter or she would die before any rescue could arrive. Yuna gathered what supplies she could carry and stepped out of the broken ship into a world of white and gray. The ice moon was beautiful in a deadly way, with vast plains of frozen crystal stretching toward distant mountains that glowed pale blue under the light of the gas giant that dominated the sky above. Wind cut through her suit and reminded her that beauty meant nothing if she could not find warmth. She activated her scanner and searched for any structure or formation that might offer protection from the coming cold. And after several minutes of walking through deepening snow, she found something that made her stop and stare. A cave system opened in the face of a low cliff, and the scanner showed that the interior temperature was significantly warmer than the surface, which meant geothermal activity somewhere below. She moved toward it without hesitation because she had no other choice. The entrance was wide enough for her to walk through without crouching, and the walls were smooth in a way that suggested they had been shaped by something other than natural forces she should have recognized. The warning signs she should have noticed. The marks on the stone and the faint smell of something animal and alive, but she was cold and tired and afraid. And she walked deeper into the cave until she rounded a corner and found herself standing in a large chamber filled with creatures that turned to look at her with eyes that glowed silver in the darkness. Korath. The word surfaced in her mind, along with everything she had learned about them during her diplomatic training. They were apex predators, pack hunters who had claimed this region of space long before humans arrived, and they were known throughout the sector for their ferocity and their absolute intolerance of intruders in their territory. The creatures before her were not adults. They were smaller, roughly the size of large wolves from Earth, with 6 limbs and fur that shimmered white and silver. And they watched her with curiosity rather than aggression. Well, she realized this was a nursery den, a place where the young were kept safe while the adults hunted. She had walked directly into the most protected space in Korath society. Every instinct told her to run, but running meant returning to the cold that would certainly kill her. And these young creatures had not attacked yet, despite having every reason to do so. She stood very still and let them approach. One of them, bolder than the others, moved close enough to sniff at her leg, and she felt the warmth of its breath. Through her damaged suit, they were warm. They were alive, and warm in a way that meant survival if she could somehow convince them not to tear her apart. Yuna lowered herself slowly to the ground, making herself smaller and less threatening, and the whelps circled around her with soft sounds that vibrated through the stone floor. She had studied Korath communication during her training, and she knew they use low-frequency vibrations as much as vocal sounds to convey meaning. She could not speak their language, but she could try to show them that she meant no harm. She opened her pack and removed one of her emergency ration bars, breaking it into pieces and holding them out in her open palm. The bold one sniffed the offering, and then took a piece carefully from her hand. The others watched and waited. And when the first one did not die or show distress, they came forward too. Within minutes she had given away half her food. But she had also earned something far more valuable. The whelps no longer saw her as a threat. They saw her as something strange and new. Something that shared food and made soft sounds and did not try to hurt them. The temperature in the cave was warmer than outside, but still cold enough to make her shiver. And the whelps seemed to notice her discomfort. The bold one pressed against her side, and its body heat seeped through her suit like a gift she had not asked for. Others followed, gathering around her in a loose pile of fur and warmth. Una found herself surrounded by young predators who had decided for reasons she could not fully understand that she belonged with them. She should have been terrified. She should have been planning her escape or preparing to defend herself. Instead, she felt something unexpected settle over her like a blanket. She felt safe. The smallest of the whelps, a runt with thin fur and eyes that seemed too large for its face, struggled to find a place among the others. And Una reached out and lifted it gently onto her lap. It weighed almost nothing, and she could feel its heartbeat rapid against her hands. This one would not survive without help. And she found herself holding it close against her chest, where her body heat could reach it most directly. Outside the cave, the temperature continued to fall. Outside the cave, the wind howled across empty ice. But inside this chamber, surrounded by creatures that should have been her enemies, Una closed her eyes and let exhaustion pull her towards sleep. She knew the adults would return. She knew that when they did, they would smell her among their young, and they would want her dead for the intrusion. But that was a problem for later. Right now she was warm, and the small one in her arms was breathing steadily. And somewhere in the galaxy, a rescue beacon was sending its weak signal into the void. She had made her choice. She had chosen to stay with the wolves rather than die alone in the cold. Now she could only wait to see if that choice would save her or destroy her.